Welcome to the WTR Healthcare Happenings Podcast. I'm your host, Tim Gerdeman, Vice Chair and Co-founder and Chief Marketing Officer of Water Tower Research. In today's podcast episode, I have the pleasure of being joined by Dr. Jim Gilligan, President and Chief Science Officer of Entropy Neurodynamics, which trades on the Australian Stock Exchange, or ASX, under ticker symbol ENP. Also joining is my Water Tower Research Equity Research colleague, Robert Sassoon. Entropy Neurodynamics, formerly known as Tryptamine Therapeutics, is a clinical stage biotechnology company focused on developing proprietary novel formulations for the administration of psilocin, the active metabolite of psilocybin, in combination with psychotherapy to treat diseases with unmet medical needs. So with that, let me welcome Jim and Robert to today's podcast.
Go ahead, Robert. I'll let you go first.
Okay, good to be here.
Yeah, and I really appreciate you guys giving me the opportunity to talk about Trip Now Entropy Neurodynamics. Thank you very much.
Yes, sir. We're excited to hear the story. So, Jim, before I hand it over to Robert, let me start by asking you to tell our listeners about your professional background, as well as providing some background color on the early history of Trip and offer a 30,000-foot view of where the company stands today.
Sure, thanks. Thanks for the opportunity. So I'm classically trained. I have a PhD in pharmacology. I did my postdoctoral research at the Roche Institute of Molecular Biology, which is where I really got involved in biotech. And it was at the Halcyon days. It was when they were doing the cloning of interferon. So at that point, started a company with other postdocs called Unigene Labs. And when I reflect on that, having a startup company in the biotech sector, I started out, at the bench doing sort of animal research. And then when they needed regulatory, I'll do regulatory. We needed clinical, I'll do clinical. I kid people, I went back to the dark side, got an MBA in international business. Nothing against you guys, of course. But through my career, I've had the opportunity to work in the whole range of areas associated with drug development. And it's really helped me as I progress into new startups because you just have that acquired experience. And so as I was sort of winding down my career in consulting, had some very interesting opportunities. And I kid people, I do a little too well because usually I consult for a bit and they say, well, can you come on full time for a bit, and help us out? And I love doing that. So that's what happened with Trip. I was approached. They actually had an oncology asset, and I looked at it. I thought it had certain value as adjunctive therapy, did that. And then they said, could you look at our PFN program? I go, well, what's that? They said, psychedelics for neuropsychiatric disorders. I go, oh no, that's way too complicated. And they said, come on, and I said, CNS is difficult. And they said, we just please take some time to look at it. And in retrospect, it was a blessing because I didn't know that much about the sector. I had to do some reading. And the turning point came, they had already brought on Robert Carhart Harris from the Imperial College of London as the head of the SAB. And they said, Jim, talk to Robin, speak with him. And I'll never forget, what would you guys do when you want to interview? You put him in Google, and he had been on the cover of Time magazine for, one of the world's younger. And I'm like, oh boy, I better up my game here a bit, and really do a little more deep dive. And that's when I started getting appreciation for looking at the biology and the pharmacology of psilocybin and, sort of going through that era of the war on drugs. You had this, Timothy Leary type of thing. And so it really opened my eyes to the fact that there was sound science behind this. And so I originally started off consulting, as I said, and then they said, oh, could you be the CSO for a while? We're going to go public on the Canadian exchange. Oh yeah, sure, I could do that. Well, actually, could you be the president and CSO? And that was 4 years ago. And so it's probably one of the most refreshing, satisfying areas I've been in. And, as we get into our discussions, the transformation we see in patients is just quite remarkable. When I was working in osteoporosis, they get an increase in BMD. You don't quite, you don't quite see that. Here it's people use the word a little too easily, but it's been transformational. So I hope that gives you a sense, and we can delve in a little bit more, into some of our programs and what we're doing now. But I think that gives you a sense of sort of at least how I got involved.
Well, thank you for that most colorful answer. I'll turn it over to Robert.
Yeah, thanks, Tim, and thank you, Jim, for joining us on this podcast. So let me actually begin by asking you what's behind the name change. You recently changed the name of the company from Trip Therapeutics to Entropy Therapeutics. So
So yeah, I'll give
behind
you the
that.
short answer now, and then I'll entertain you a little bit further on. But part of it has to do with we're domiciled in Australia now, and as some of the work we're doing, we're looking at actually, as I said, the mechanism of action for psilocybin, and we started doing real-time EEG and fMRI, doing a number of things to look at what happens in the brain. And one of the things that we see is a change in brain entropy. And I'll explain that a little bit later as we go into our results. And so the folks in Australia felt that being just a psychedelic company was in a way, not explaining the full benefit that we're seeing from our approach. And so they elected to change the name to Entropy Neurodynamics. So.
Okay, thanks for that. We'll definitely want to listen to further explanation down the road here.
Yeah,
Anyway,
sure.
before we delve in a little more into your development pipeline, can you tell us about the rationale for Entropy's prioritization for targeting binge eating?
Yeah, it's a great question, Robert. When Trip got involved in this sector, the psychedelic sector, you had the luminaries, you had Compass, Simon, and most of the folks were in TRD, anxiety, depression. So one of the key strategic issues we looked at is where else might psychedelic assisted therapy have a benefit to patients? And so we focused on sort of three areas. One is eating disorders. That could be anorexia or binge eating, but we selected binge eating. The other, since I'm the CSO, makes me sound smart, nosoplastic pain. And nosoplastic pain is pain that originates in the brain. The best example is phantom limb, where someone loses an arm and they have pain there. So obviously the pain isn't from the limb, it's in the brain. So we looked at fibromyalgia. And lastly, actually, we can't take credit for this. The folks at Harvard MGH were interested in what's called the gut-brain axis, and they wanted to look at patients with IBS that had chronic abdominal pain and asked if we would work with them. And certainly we agreed. So we looked at those three areas with the hopes that we would see a benefit. And we've been incredibly fortunate in that in all three of those areas, we've seen a very good signal that this approach has a benefit to the patient. So it was really identifying new area. We could be first movers, and from a corporate perspective, establish an IP so that we have use patents in areas where others hadn't, looked prior.
Got that. Now, you produced pretty positive results from your oral psilocybin phase 2A proof of concept study in binge eating disorder. So, can you actually start off by reminding us of the key outcomes of that trial?
Well, one of the things that we've seen across the trials and in binge eating is, traditionally when you design a clinical study, you look at the patient and you characterize them by sort of a singular symptom. They have binge eating or they have pain. And what we were looking at was, so it's a little more complex, but so some of them have anxiety, some of them have depression, some of them have a spectrum of other symptoms. And so in our study, we looked at not just binge eating per se, but we looked at other issues that affected the patients. And so what we looked at was a number of binge eating episodes, which, how frequently did that occur? How frequent did you really feel like you lost control of your eating behavior? And then we did look using the HAD score for anxiety and depression. And the other thing we did, and which I thought was important, is everyone had a diary for 28 days. And so they had to record on their diary every day the questions related to eating behavior, anxiety, and depression. And during that period of time, they had this 6 or 8 hours of preparatory interaction with the therapist, fMRI. So they had all of those things over the first 4 weeks, and then they had the dosing session. So we had a really fresh baseline where we can compare what occurred during that period of time, anticipate all the things that could impact their eating behavior. Then you administer the drug and you do integration and the week after. And the effect size is pretty remarkable. 80% reduction in binge eating episode, how frequently they lost control, improvement in anxiety and depression. Now, again, open label, no placebo, but when you see that magnitude of an effect, and importantly, what the actual patient said, how we transformed their lives and improved, and it was interesting. Some of the people would have, like, say their trigger was Taco Bell. So, family members go, hey, let's go to Taco Bell. And they're like, yeah, I'll go, but, I'm really not hungry, so I'll just hang out with you. And they said the most amazing thing was they didn't have to sit there and say, oh, I can't eat. It was just natural. So there's this transformation that's so encouraging that basically wants you to carry on and continue to examine that.
That's pretty impressive. But now,
Yeah,
given that had these strong phase 2A proof of concept results from TRP 880202,
right.
that's what the official label is, I guess, in
Yeah,
that trial. Entropy has now begun dosing patients in another phase 2A study. Um, it's really basically, again, targeting binge eating disorder, but this time it's using an IV infusion of psilocybin for formulation. So how
It's
does
actually, Robert, it's actually psilocin. It's actually psilocin. So
well, I'm British,
yes,
remember.
yeah, no, that's fine. So and it's a great question, because as we were doing these three studies, we're talking about, we used oral psilocybin just like everybody else. And the feedback we were getting from the therapist was that the intensity, and there was some variability. We even had one call up and say, is this from the same batch? We're not seeing the same type of effect that we would expect. And so, of course, I ring up Robin Carhart Harris and I go, Robin, we're seeing some variability here. And he goes, oh, yeah, Jim, that's sort of understood. He goes, in a study, I'll have a 60-kilo woman, give them the oral capsule. An hour later, she's looking at me saying, is this it? And then I'll give a capsule to you. I play basketball in college. I'm a bigger guy, let's just say. And so, and I have a fulsome journey. And I'm like, well, how can that be? And that's the segue to where psilocybin is actually a prodrug, and your body converts it to psilocin, which is what goes to the brain and induces the psychedelic experience. So, Robert, if you do 25% conversion, I do 100%, I'm going to have 4 times higher blood levels. Similarly, anything you swallow goes through first pass metabolism. So, sure enough, we talked to Paul Hudson at University, and we found out, looking at individual blood levels, that they were really, really variable. So from a corporate perspective, if you're going to start looking at new indications and you don't know what the blood levels are going to be, or whether you're going to achieve the requisite blood levels, that's going to be a problem. That was number one. The other, from a logistical commercial perspective, is the current treatment paradigm for, say, for Compass in their study is, and anyone using oral, so you come in, you're administered the capsule, it takes an hour or two for you to commence your journey, and that could last another 6 or 8 hours. So you have 2 therapists in the room for at least a full day. And we felt that could also be a commercial impediment. Okay. The other decision we made is that, at least for the first 2 treatment, which most studies involve 2 treatment, you have administered the drug, then 2 or 3 weeks later, you're administered the drug again. And we felt that that would always be performed in a clinical setting, because these patients need to have medical professional assistance, during the drug administration. So once we had looked at all that, we said, well, why don't we do an IV infusion where we give the drug over about 20 minutes to a target. You do it nice and slow so that they don't get the vomiting and nausea that's associated with it. It's not traumatic. And then once we achieve a target blood level, we slow it down and we keep it there for a prescribed period of time. And I kid the investors. I go, hey, if they're having a profound journey, we just put another quarter in the machine, keep it going, let them finish their trip. But it also allows us to adjust the duration. And in one of our studies, for example, we had a patient experience tachycardia. we turned the infusion off, heart rate came down. If they had swallowed a capsule, you can't reverse that. So we just felt that the IV had a number of advantages, and let me say more to address some of the limitations associated with oral psilocybin. And as a kicker, much better IP around IV psilocin than you would get around psilocybin.
Okay. Now, Entropy Neurodynamics, I misspoke earlier. I called it Entropy Therapeutics, but it's actually Entropy Neurodynamics. They
Right.
completed a phase 2A study for fibromyalgia.
Hmm.
It's again TRP 88802. That's
Right.
a collaboration with the University of Michigan, I believe.
Yes.
And they also produced positive pain results. That was, using again oral psilocybin, right? Where does
Yes.
that program stand now, and what comprises the full pipeline beyond binge eating?
Sure. So that was very positive. And so that study is complete. It's been published. And again, you get tremendous insight from these studies. You start realizing that in this particular case with fibromyalgia, traditional approaches are addressing the symptom, not the cause of the disease. You're putting a Band-Aid on things.
Mm.
And what we found with the psychedelic assisted therapy is you actually address the cause of the pain. And let me just explain this a little bit. Dan Claw at University of Michigan explained this quite well to me. He calls it memorized pain. And I said, well, what do you mean by that? And he said, well, let me give you an analogy. You're in your car and you hear a couple of chords to a song and you know the whole song. He said, that's because there's a neural loop. I go, yeah, I get that. He said, well, do you ever go to sleep at night, you get a song stuck in your head and you can't get it out, it just keeps going? I said, yeah. And he said, well, that's what nosoplastic pain is. It's memorized pain, and you have a pain loop that's sort of switched in the on position. And when you give a psychedelic with the neuroplasticity properties, it's able to turn that pain switch off. It's actually able to rearrange neural networks. And so when we looked at fibromyalgia, you have 35% of folks resort to opiates. They can't sleep. They're taking SSRIs. So they're taking, polypharmacy. And so the take home we got out of that is that we think that this approach for folks with whether it be phantom limb, complex regional pain syndrome, fibromyalgia, that this approach will have a benefit for the patients and across again a whole spectrum of endpoints. I recently gave a talk at a pain conference, and I called it patient-centric outcomes. Again, as I mentioned before, we tend to see patients by a singular symptom. These folks, anxiety, couldn't sleep at night, loss of social function. So we measured, a number of quality of life measures. And again, small numbers, they all improved. And that's what was important to the patient. So what's important to them? Well, they have this benefit across the board for a number of these symptoms. And so again, super encouraging for us. The IBS that you mentioned study up at MGH, we're up to the last patient there. The results again have been quite remarkable. And the thing that I neglected to say before that really was intriguing to me is the durability of response. And by what I mean by that is we give two treatments. And for example, in the IBS study, we have a couple people out 6 months past the period where they got the second dose, where they still don't have any abdominal pain. So clearly the drug's not there. You've done something in the CNS that's provided a benefit. So it's really a new approach. It's transformational from that perspective and how we're looking at mental illness and how we're approaching it.
That's really quite encouraging.
Yeah.
Can you now run through your milestone priorities for the current year, 2026?
Yeah. So what we needed to do was work out what's the doses and infusion rates for psilocin in order to achieve our low, medium, and high levels, reach psychedelic intensity scores. And this is where the entropy thing comes in. What we started doing was we started looking at real-time EEG, Robert, and saying, can we find a change in EEG patterns that's correlated with entering the psychedelic state? And because it's a very subjective measure, especially if people are psychedelic naive or not. But in working with Robin has a hypothesis that using real-time EEG, you can actually measure change in brain entropy that is correlated with predicting a positive clinical outcome. And so we're looking at that as, dare I say, a PD biomarker where you could dose to where you achieve a certain change in brain entropy levels, and that would be predictive of a positive clinical outcome. So in our studies now, in this binge eating study and what we'll plan for further this year in the US is, can we confirm that these changes that Robin's observed in other studies in brain entropy are correlated with a positive clinical outcome? The other thing we're doing is arranging to meet with the FDA to review all of our phase 1 results on how we came to our dose, all the safety. In addition to looking at changes in real-time EEG and brain entropy, a key goal for this year is to meet with FDA to go through our clinical development plan and make certain that, not just because we think it's a great plan, a great idea, but we get concordance from FDA. And we're taking advantage of the fact that Lykos, there was a complete response letter with Lykos, and they've come out with, FDA guidance. And so we want to make sure that when we start going into these clinical programs, that nothing has to be repeated. We're very mindful of the investors' money. We spend it like our own, and we want to make sure that as we progress, we're doing exactly what needs to be done. And really looking to move forward. The other thing that I should have answered before to you, Robert, when we're talking about pipeline or targets, one of the things that a lot of the academics people are coming to us and saying, what's really interesting is we could look at if it's alcohol use disorder, anorexia, any area where psilocybin has shown to be a benefit. We're quite confident that TRIP-8803 IV psilocin would be equally or maybe even more effective in treating those other disease entities. And so, kidding folks, I think you get that from me. I'm sorry, I can't be serious for too long. I say, hey, let those folks go out and take all the arrows, figure it out, and then then we can come in with 8803 and demonstrate that we're equally or more effective. And I think part of getting down to the nitty-gritty is our effect size is so we looks like, and it's going to be consistent because we control the blood levels, that will translate to smaller clinical studies and higher efficacy, because the power analysis on what you need to do in order to achieve that statistical significance will suggest smaller studies. So we think that's an advantage as well.
All right, thank you for that information. So it seems that like you have a lot on your development plate. So can you speak to your financial capacity and financial strategy to advance all these programs?
Yeah, so right now, as you mentioned, we're doing the initial studies in Australia, and in Australia you get 43 to 48% rebate from the government, so that helps stretch your dollar, and it doesn't hurt that the Australian dollar right now is about 67 cents on the dollar, so that's quite effective. And we just before the new year raised another 6 million Australian, so we're doing it incrementally, so we have enough to advance our programs. And part of what we want to do, obviously, is since we started the binge eating study at Swinburne University, we want to be able to announce that, get investor, excitement about that, and really, for me, deliver on what we're telling people that we're going to do, to make sure that we keep them informed about what our next steps are, and then also making certain that we can achieve what we've laid out as our ambitious goals, as you said, for the coming year. Part of it is to maintain focus. You have so many people saying, "Oh, you could do this, you could do this," and we could, but we have to, select which we think are the best options for going forward, and to demonstrate the utility. You know, One of the things that we can do, for example, is we can get to a target blood level, and instead of infusing for 2 hours, what if we infuse for another 30 minutes? We have total control over optimizing dosing, and it could be different for different indications. So it's going to sound, obviously it's biased, but I think we have the best tool, the best mousetrap for using psychedelics, or at least in the psilocybin field, for advancing the field. And I think that we're going to learn a lot in 2026. So, as they say, stay tuned. And I can't get away without saying, it's been quite the trip for the last couple of years, and I
Right.
think it'll continue.
Well, that's great. Thanks for all that information, and thank you, Jim, for letting us into the world of entropy. So I'm going to pass it back to Tim.
Thanks, Robert. Jim, a quick ad lib question before we wrap up. So, Robert and I do quite a few of these podcasts talking about psilocybin and MDMA. And the one indication I did not hear you speak to was PTSD. Is that something you're looking into as well?
Yes, I think it's known that I'm actually a consultant to the U.S. Department of Defense on their PTSD program. So
Oh, I did. That's awesome.
yeah, so I'm quite familiar with the field. And yes, I can just say there's considerable interest in the use of something like TRIP for veterans because of the controlled nature, and would be perfect for the VA hospital. So that's something we're quite mindful of, and it's something personally important to me. And so I think that is an area where we'll see activity going forward. And I think there's a real need for that. So, that's something I'm personally passionate about, and hopefully we can do something with that as we progress.
Yeah, Robert's heard me talk about this in the past, but I was deeply, deeply impacted as a young child from uncles returning from Vietnam. So that's a passion of mine as
Yeah.
well. I hope you're successful in that.
Yeah. Yeah. I can just give you one, Tim. My cousin was in Vietnam, and he took us to 4th of July to the park to go see fireworks, and the fireworks went up, and he took off. He took off. We were, and I'll never forget that. So, and there's many more. I've been going to the Psychedelic conference in Denver where veterans talk about their journey. So yeah, I'm very, as I said, passionate about trying to do something there.
Well, I
Mm.
commend you for your work there because it's truly heartbreaking. Thank you
Yeah.
so much. I'm excited to watch the journey toward commercialization. So thanks for your time today, Jim and Robert.
Thank you guys.
Thank
Appreciate it.
you.
Thank you for listening, and don't forget to subscribe, as well as visiting www.watertowerresearch.com to stay up to speed on the company's small cap written research reports, podcasts, fireside chats, industry specific symposiums, and conference schedules. We will see you next time for another edition of the WTR Healthcare Happenings Podcast. Finally, a special thanks to the producer and editor of the podcast, Krista Fitzpatrick.